And I'm very excited to introduce today Tal Shalev, who is a well-known expert on Israeli politics, Israeli political landscape, and she's the chief political correspondent for Walla News, which is the one of the largest Israeli websites covering Israeli politics. And she indeed is the covering the political aspects and the political landscape of the country, along with foreign affairs and diplomatic issues, and has previously served also as news editor for Haaretz and I-24 News. So, as we all know, we are kind of in the midst of the storm today. On March 23rd, Israelis went to the polls for the fourth time to vote in the fourth elections in 2 years. And that brought us to another political deadlock, as both the blocs supportive of Prime Minister Netanyahu and an opposition bloc, let's say, did not get enough, did not fail to secure a result that would lead them clearly for a stable coalition. And now, today, we're going to try to make sense of this political landscape and discuss what are the key takeaways and what are the possible scenarios for the future. So just before we jump in, please make sure to post your questions throughout the program in the chat box, and we'll make sure to let you ask them live, or we'll ask them on your behalf in the second part of this event. So now, Tal, thanks again for joining us, and especially thanks for joining us as the news are breaking every 10 minutes about the recommendations from different parties on who they think should be the next prime minister. And before we go into discussing possible scenarios, I wanted to ask you where we are in the political process, if you could help us understand what happens today and what are the next steps for the for the president and for the potential coalition leaders moving forward.
So hi everyone, I'm happy to be here. We are speaking at the peak of this process, of this stage we are in right now, because I will apologize in advance and say that we are waiting for breaking news from the president's residence, and it will come out during this talk. So I will try to be mostly concentrated on this, but sometimes I might be looking to my phone to see if there's a push notification. Every election campaign basically in Israel has 3 stages. The first stage is just the campaigning, which is 3 months, and I would say that's maybe the most boring part of the election altogether, because the most interesting parts of stages of the election is after the election. First, the second stage in which we are right now, which is the recommendation stage, in which all of the factions in the Knesset, this time it's 13 factions because there are a lot of small parties. We can talk about how the map is changing later, but a lot of small parties. So there have been 13 parties since 9:30 this morning, in a marathon of meetings at the president's residence, meeting with President Rivlin, and basically recommending one of the candidates for the prime minister. I was there until 4 o'clock. It's a ceremony, it's a traditional ceremony, but you know, when you do it for the 4th time in 2 years, it doesn't seem or feel so festive. Also, because we still seem to be in a deadlock. What's different from the previous elections is that this time, in the last 3 election rounds, there were 2 candidates at the president's. I mean, 2 candidates who were trying to get, you know, the mandate to form a government. This time, there are 3 candidates, and that kind of complicates the picture. So as we speak, the president is meeting, I think, with the 10th party or the 10th party, which is probably the most. We're waiting to hear what Gideon Sa'ar, the leader of Tikva Hadasha, New Hope, one of the new right-wing parties that ran in the last election, who is he going to recommend? So there are basically 3 candidates: Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, and Naftali Bennett, who recommended himself. If Gideon Sa'ar recommends Yair Lapid, it's most likely that Yair Lapid will have altogether more recommendations than Netanyahu. If he doesn't, then there's no way then any of the candidates will have any chance to have more recommendations than Netanyahu. After this ceremony finishes this evening, the president takes some time to contemplate, and sometime in the next 48 hours, he will announce who will be receiving the mandate. Traditionally, this used to go to the person who had more mandates or more recommendations. This time, it's a bit more complicated, because none of the candidates have a majority of 61 seats, which makes them, on path to forming a real government. Sorry. And I lost my thread of thought. I'm sorry. I'm going to get back to that. None of the candidates have 61. And also the president has already said several times that he will be taking into consideration several factors. And basically the law gives him a very widespread shikul dat, Shai, shikul dat?
Discretion.
Discretion, thank you. Gives the president a widespread discretion. He needs to give it to the mandate to the person that he thinks has the best chances of forming a government. What does that mean? Does that mean that Netanyahu, if he has 52 recommendations more than Lapid, does he have a better chance at forming a government? Because he's already tried to do so in the past 3 elections and he didn't really succeed. So this is some of the politics that are going on into this stage. Then we'll start the third stage, which is after giving the mandate, the first person, the candidate who will be given the mandate, will have 28 days to try and form a coalition. He can get another 14-day extension, even though I don't think the president will be very generous with his time in this round. If he succeeds to form a government, great. He won't, probably. If he doesn't, then the president has another round of consultations, and then he can decide to give it to another candidate, or he can decide to give the mandate back to the Knesset. And then there are basically 3 weeks, a period of 3 weeks in which the Knesset can decide to give the mandate to any one of the Knesset members. Altogether, this is a process that could take up to 8 to 12 weeks, meaning that we're just at the beginning of the elections in that sense, because the elections are basically not over until a new government is sworn in. That being said, given what we call the plonter, what we call the deadlock, we might not have a government sworn in during this time, and a 5th election is definitely a plausible scenario, unfortunately.
So exactly following up on this last point, I wanted to really ask you, what are the chances that we are heading into another round of elections? I know that probably it's better to wait another 20 minutes and we'll know even more. I saw a recent poll by, I think, Channel 12 that said that more than half Israelis actually don't believe a government will be formed. So it's both the question of political will and the trust from the public. And the question is, how likely are we to be in this endless loop and how to get out of it?
So there are 2 answers to that. There's the optimistic one and the pessimistic one. The pessimistic one will say that the Israeli political system has been normalizing an abnormal situation and has found this, especially Netanyahu, but the whole system. He has 119 other, collaborators in the Knesset who have found this system of, going to another and another elections instead of actually trying to form a government. And the pessimistic point of view will say, that the main reason for the deadlock, the main reason for this situation, the political chaos that Israel is in the past has been in more than 2 years, it hasn't found, it hasn't been solved. And that is the big tension there is between the fact that you have a prime minister who's extremely strong and extremely popular by his own supporters, but is also being indicted and is under trial, and thus illegitimate by a growing part of the Israeli political scene. And that tension and those two camps, the camp that support Netanyahu and the camp that don't support Netanyahu, they're only getting stronger and stronger in their own convictions, and the deadlock hasn't been broken in the fourth time in a row. So the pessimistic answer will say that most of Israeli politicians, as we speak, are entangled in previous commitments, in campaign promises that made not to sit with this person or another. And, judging by the past, it's most likely that they won't rise or they won't break those promises, and we could be on our way to another election. The optimistic part of this would want to say that, a fifth election, that you're hearing growing voices inside the Israeli political scene that are getting fed up with this situation and understand that a fifth election will not necessarily solve it. And that being said, this is about Netanyahu's legal situation, but as I said, there are another 119 Knesset members. And what we've seen in the past 3 elections is that basically, this is very generalizing, but basically all of those 119 MKs submitted themselves to Netanyahu's will because they couldn't overcome their promises or their demands one from another. And maybe this time they will be able to do so. It could go to each side. Netanyahu could be very close to forming another government, a right-wing government. And the other side could also do it. It's doable. It just depends on having the will and having, the stamina to make difficult decisions and to break previous promises that were made to election. And that puts it's also in kind of, a paradox, because here I am saying, well, the optimistic scenario is for politicians to break their word, which is not a very optimistic thing to say, but that's where we've come, because most of these words and promises are basically just disqualifications of other partners, and this is what makes this this deadlock impossible to solve.
Okay, so we know now what's the pessimistic scenario, and let's focus for a second more on this optimistic. And if you could help us understand what are the possible scenarios that could prevent us from heading to the 5th round of elections, and who are the potential kingmakers you mentioned, Bennett, and we should probably also mention Mansour Abbas, and if you could speak also about them.
So basically there are 3 scenarios that I see that could lead to a government and to forming a government. The first one is that Netanyahu could eventually reach 61 or reach 65. Netanyahu today, his bloc, his most loyal bloc, which is formed out of the ultra-Orthodox parties and the very religious National Zionist Party led by Tal Shalev, one would say extremist party. They have 52 seats, but with Bennett, they have 59. So basically all Netanyahu needs is another faction, or perhaps some defectors from two defectors from the other camp, and he will be able to form a government. We'll talk about Mansour Abbas later, but generally there was one of the scenarios that was discussed that Netanyahu would form a government with his natural allies from the ultra-Orthodox and religious parties, while having Ra'am, the Islamist party, abstain. At the moment, that doesn't seem plausible politically, because the Bezalel Smotrich, the extreme right-wing leader of the National Zionist Party, the religious Zionist Party, he has ruled that out. So at the moment, that's not a plausible scenario. But at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, one of the scenarios could be that one of the parties from the other side will join Netanyahu, and they will say that this is to prevent a 5th election. That will be the justification. But this is a scenario that can only happen. All of the scenarios, by the way, that I'm discussing can probably only happen like after time goes by. If Netanyahu will have any defectors from the other camp, it'll only be like when it's really 2 days ahead of election, because someone will be very scared of going to a 5th election because he might be wiped out. So it'll be better for him to join Netanyahu and form his government. Potential candidates for this could be Gidon Sa'ar, for instance, even though today I don't see that as a very likable scenario. But Benny Gantz, for instance, who already, joined Netanyahu's government in the past, he could be a candidate, even though Gantz has other interests that might want him to lead to a 5th election. Generally just saying, if we eventually do fall into a 5th election, then the current government that is serving, which is an interim government in which Gantz is supposedly a substitute prime minister, it could last till November. And supposedly Gantz could have the chance to become prime minister during through the rotation agreement that was signed last year. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's a scenario that's being discussed. The two other scenarios are a Lapid-Bennett government. Wait, I think there's been, okay, so I will give you breaking news. Sa'ar did not recommend anyone, meaning that Lapid will not have more votes than Netanyahu, more recommendations than Netanyahu at the end of the day. And which means that Netanyahu will probably get the mandate before Lapid, even though the president all day has been, spreading hints that he will be taking into consideration other factors such as values. The president, by the way, has never given Netanyahu the mandate since his trial has started. So it's going to be interesting. Sorry, back to the scenarios. So there are two other scenarios, which one is a Lapid-Bennett government. Discussions are underway for such a government. This is a government that would include a coalition that would include Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, Yemina, Naftali Bennett's party, in some rotation agreement between them. Gidon Sa'ar, Labor, Blue and White, Israel Beitenu, and Meretz. And in order for it to be sworn in, you would have to have the Arab parties part of the game, or at least not come to the vote. And the third scenario is probably the least likely scenario, but it should be said, is that Bennett and Sa'ar eventually succeed to, create some havoc in the Likud. And at the end of this process, they will be able to form a government with the Likud without Netanyahu. Some of the scenarios that are being discussed talk about running Netanyahu to presidency. Rivlin is finishing his post this July, meaning that elections for the next president are supposed to happen in May. And Netanyahu himself and some of the senior Likud ministers have been checking the option of running Netanyahu and having him run become president, and then, opening up the system and opening up the deadlock and enabling 65 right-wing government and coalition to be formed. I don't think that's plausible. Netanyahu himself is not very enthusiastic about running to presidency. He himself prefers to continue to be prime minister, even if he has to go to a 5th election, than to take the chance of getting elected to president. And that without even talking about, the legal and moral implications of having an indicted candidate be elected to president. I apologize for my stuttering in English.
Thanks, Tal, for those scenarios. And I think now we'll turn for a bit to the international arena, which is what interests us a lot at ELNET, as we are working to strengthen relations between Israel and European countries, but looking also at how these elections and potential outcomes could impact Israel's foreign policy, its relations on one hand with Europe, on the other hand with the Biden administration. And I know there is a lot of, most Israeli analysts tend to say that there is a broad consensus on main issues on foreign policy, be it the Iranian threat, the normalization with Arab countries, the ICC investigation. Yet I think there are some, if not maybe changes in policy, changes in tone. And I would like you to help us understand what are really those dividing lines in the foreign policy arena between the main players.
So I would like to say that unfortunately, foreign policy hasn't played a role at all in the last election, because Netanyahu usually dominates the agenda of the campaign. For 3 elections, it was very useful for him to play the international card and show off his relationship with President Trump. This time he had Biden in the White House. It's a totally different international arena. So foreign policy was not at the top of the agenda at all and wasn't even discussed. Not even the normalization wasn't celebrated, I think, as Netanyahu would like to. You're very precise. The differences on most of the main issues, there's quite a wide consensus, and there are differences in style. I think the difference is mainly in style, not so much in principle. I think the principles are very much the same. If you try to look for a difference between Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, then of course there's a difference on the Palestinian issue. But Lapid is very hawkish, considered, to a center left, and Bennett will have to be more pragmatic if he becomes prime minister. So I think that at the end of the day, and also at the end of the day, one should say that Netanyahu himself has been quite pragmatic in most of his foreign policy. So it's not as if there's much to challenge him on that part, but there will be a significant difference in the way decisions are made. Today, much of the decisions are made in the prime minister's office, bypassing, the security system, the foreign ministry. The foreign minister and the defense minister didn't even know about the normalization agreements before they were announced. Netanyahu goes to secret flights to Saudi Arabia without letting the IDF know. He hasn't been convening, there's a security cabinet, which is half of the government, which is supposed to convene regularly to discuss foreign policy issues. I think it's been discussed, it's been convened 5 or 6 times in the past year or so, and not for serious discussions. And Netanyahu, in many ways, also uses foreign policy for his own interests. Many times this coincides with Israel's interests, but many times you don't really know what is dictating more. Some of the close relationships he has with some of the world's more, I would say, controversial leaders. I don't think that Yair Lapid necessarily will, Yair Lapid would not necessarily, foster a relationship with Hungary's Orban and not with Brazil's Bolsonaro. So I think there's a difference on style. And of course, the big difference, I think it has to do also with Europe, but mostly with the United States, is, the day-to-day diplomacy. Netanyahu, in many ways, when he plays diplomacy with the US, he feels at home. And he feels like very secure, and he plays like he plays the American game. I think that any other prime minister instead of him, directions would go back to being very much more professional and not necessarily personal. That will happen anyway with the Biden administration, because it's not as close and personal as it was with the Trump White House. But it's more about the styles. That being said, there are, of course, big differences on issues that have to do with, the two-state solution and where to take the normalization from here on. Relationship with Jordan has been an issue of political contention in the past few weeks. And in that, you will find differences between Netanyahu's, competitors. If there was to if a government a coalition could form with Lapid and Bennett and Meretz and Labor and Lieberman all together, you can assume that they would have to find a very wide consensus on anything that has to do with any issue, especially with the Palestinians. It would probably be a government, and this is what they're talking about, that would be defined as an emergency government aimed at dealing mainly with the economic, rehabilitation after COVID-19, and they won't be dealing with heavyweight foreign policy issues unless, besides those that emerge anyway.
So looking at one of those scenarios, either such emergency government that wouldn't really focus on foreign policy, or maybe no government at all and another round of elections, how will this impact the Israel's ability to act on those issues? We have, from ICC investigation to Iran issues, things that are happening regardless of Israel's, time to deal with it. And the question is, who will be taking the lead? And we've seen recently President and the IDF chief of staff traveling to Europe to discuss Iran issue. Will they be playing more role as the political establishment is kind of in turbulence, or how will the foreign policy be led in the next months? And before I let you answer this question, I want to remind everyone to please post your questions in the chat box. And after this question, I'll be happy to open it to everybody else.
So I'm saying this with sorrow. As long as Netanyahu is prime minister, and he's prime minister as long as there's no other government that would replace him, and we don't see that at the moment. As long as he's prime minister, everything will be very much concentrated and centralized from the prime minister's office, and even more, because under the political instability, Netanyahu has succeeded, to even concentrate even more power and more authority, and keep shut out other factors. He and Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, they have a good security dialogue. So I think the only thing they can cooperate has to do with security. That's the only thing that they can discuss without getting into fights. But at large, everything is kind of frozen. I think that tomorrow or tonight, Netanyahu is convening for the first time a real policy discussion on the ICC. I think it's been 3 weeks. I think it's been 3 weeks since the decision to open an investigation was made, and this is the first time that there's a high echelon meeting on it, and it's just days away from when Israel has to submit its answer, and there hasn't been a high echelon roundtable on this up until now because of the political turmoil. That being said, we don't have at the moment, there's no justice minister. There's no justice minister. Netanyahu has refused to appoint Gantz Gantz was serving as, a substitute prime minister, and Netanyahu has refused to make his appointment a final appointment. So at the moment, there's no justice minister. That also has implications, by the way, on the battle at the ICC, how things are going at the Justice Ministry, but also on other international issues that, have to do with granting clemency or deportations, a lot of issues. There are about 33 or 36 posts in the foreign ministry that have been waiting for approval they've been approved by the foreign ministry in November, and we're already 5 months since, and they haven't been approved by the government, meaning that you have 36 embassies and around the world that don't know when and who is going to come and lead them. And you also have 36 ambassadors or to-be ambassadors who have no idea how things are going to do. This all creates a very bad picture for how foreign policy is being led until a government will be, you know, a stable government will be formed.